It started out like any other evening. I was in my office at home, replying to emails and making notes for the following day. From the living room, I could hear the background murmur of a TV show Emily was watching. My wife had been in unusually high spirits for the past few weeks. She'd been humming while moving around the house, something she hadn't done in years. "Dinner's ready," she called from the kitchen. Her voice had an energy to it that didn't match the usual tone of our evenings. When I walked into the dining room, the table was already set. Emily had prepared roast chicken with all the trimmings, mashed potatoes, green beans, the works. The meal was one of her specialties, something she used to make only for special occasions. "This looks fantastic," I said, taking my seat. "Thought I'd do something nice tonight," she replied casually, though her smile seemed almost too practiced. During dinner, she kept the conversation flowing. She talked about her day at work, mentioning a new project her team had started, and how demanding her boss had been lately. Then she brought up a corporate retreat scheduled for the weekend. "It's just a short trip," she said, taking a sip of wine. "Workshops and team-building exercises, nothing too exciting." Her words sounded natural enough, but something about her tone felt rehearsed. I listened carefully, offering the occasional nod, but I didn't press her for details. Sometimes it's better to let someone talk uninterrupted. They reveal more that way. After dinner, Emily cleared the dishes and left her phone charging on the counter. Normally, she kept it close, always checking it or carrying it around. Tonight, however, she seemed unconcerned, heading upstairs to take a shower without a second glance at the device. That small detail caught my attention. I walked into the kitchen, hesitating for a moment before picking up her phone. A notification lit up the screen, a text from someone labeled M. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Last night was unforgettable." I read the words twice, making sure I wasn't imagining things. Whoever M was, the message didn't leave much room for interpretation. I heard the faint sound of water turning off upstairs. Placing the phone exactly where she'd left it, I returned to the living room, sitting down and pretending to browse through my laptop. A few minutes later, Emily came downstairs, her hair wrapped in a towel. She smiled warmly as she passed by, acting as though nothing had changed. "Thanks for helping with the dishes," she said, sitting down on the couch. "Of course," I replied, keeping my tone even. Inside, I was already replaying the details, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed time to figure out my next steps, and most importantly, I needed to stay in control. The morning after I saw the message, everything seemed normal, or at least, Emily wanted it to seem that way. She hummed softly in the kitchen while preparing coffee, acting as though nothing had changed. "I was thinking," she began as she poured my cup, "why don't we have a barbecue on Saturday? Maybe invite a few friends over?" I looked up from my tablet, masking my thoughts. "Sounds like a good idea," I said, keeping my tone even. Her suggestion caught me off guard. Saturday was the day she claimed she'd be out of town for the company retreat. I nodded again, as if nothing seemed out of place. As soon as she left for work, I found myself replaying everything from the night before. Her sudden shift in attitude, the text, the way she spoke about the retreat, it all felt calculated. I decided to dig deeper. Starting with our shared bank account, I scrolled through recent transactions. My eyes stopped on several restaurant charges at places I'd never heard of, all during lunch hours. Then there were the smaller charges, boutiques, flower shops, and even a jewelry store. Emily never mentioned any of these purchases. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Jumping to conclusions wouldn't help. I needed facts. I made a call to Greg, a friend of mine who works in cybersecurity. We'd known each other for years, and I trusted him to be discreet. "I need your help," I said. "What's going on?" he asked. "There's something strange going on with Emily. Can you check a number for me?" Greg hesitated. You sure about this? I wouldn't ask if I wasn't. After a long pause, he agreed. Send me the details. I'll see what I can do. By the afternoon, Greg had sent me a detailed log of calls and messages from Emily's phone. One number stood out immediately. It was the same M from the text. Dozens of calls, some lasting over an hour. Messages exchanged during work hours, in the evenings, even on weekends. That evening, Emily returned home, her cheerful mood still intact. She talked about her day while we ate dinner, her voice light and carefree. How's the retreat shaping up? I asked casually, gauging her reaction. Oh, it's going to be great, she said, barely missing a beat. It's a good opportunity to network with people from other departments. Networking. That word felt wrong somehow, but I kept my expression neutral. After dinner, Emily went to bed early, saying she had a busy day ahead. I stayed downstairs, pretending to work, but my thoughts were focused on one thing, figuring out my next move. The day after receiving the phone records, my mind felt like a storm that wouldn't settle. I went through the motions at work, but every spare moment, my thoughts returned to that number, AM. I couldn't let it go. By lunch, I gave in. Closing my office door, I picked up my phone and called Greg. I need more information, I said without preamble. Greg's voice was cautious. You mean about the number? Exactly. Can you trace it? Get me a name, maybe even an address? There was a pause. You sure you want to go down this road? I don't have a choice. He sighed. All right. I'll see what I can do, but this isn't quick work. Give me a day or two. I thanked him, but frustration gnawed at me. Time felt like my enemy, yet I knew better than to act on half-formed suspicions. If I was going to confront Emily, I needed everything. That evening, the first thing I noticed when I walked into the house was the absence of her phone. It wasn't charging on the kitchen counter like usual. Instead, it was nowhere in sight. How was your day? She asked as she stirred something on the stove. Same as always. Yours? Busy, she said with a laugh. Oh, by the way, I booked a spa day tomorrow. Just thought I'd treat myself before the retreat. Her tone was casual, but the words hit differently. Emily wasn't the type to splurge on spas, and the timing felt too convenient. Sounds nice, I said, keeping my voice level. The next morning, I followed my usual routine, at least on the surface. After leaving the house, I parked a few blocks away and waited. When Emily finally left, I followed her from a safe distance. She wasn't heading to a spa. After about 15 minutes, her car pulled into a small cafe's parking lot. I parked across the street and waited, my eyes fixed on the entrance. She walked in alone. A few minutes later, a man joined her at a table near the window. From where I sat, I could see their faces clearly. They were relaxed, too comfortable to be anything but close. I reached for my phone and took a few photos. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm what I'd suspected. They stayed for nearly an hour. I watched as he leaned closer to her, whispering something that made her laugh. Her expression, warm, familiar, was one I hadn't seen directed at me in years. When they finally left, they drove off in separate directions. I followed Emily back to the house, making sure to keep my distance. That evening, I couldn't bear to sit across from her at the dinner table. I made an excuse about being swamped with work and stayed in my office. She didn't press me, and I wondered if she was too distracted by thoughts of him to notice my mood. After she went to bed, I studied the photos I'd taken earlier. The man was well-dressed, confident, maybe a few years older than me. His presence in her life was undeniable now. I could have confronted her right then, but what would that accomplish? She'd deny it, twist the story, maybe even turn it back on me. No, I needed a plan. Something she wouldn't see coming. For now, I had the pictures. soon, I'd have the rest. The photos I'd taken at the cafe were all the confirmation I needed, but they didn't give me the full story. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't in control of my own life, and I hated that feeling. If Emily thought she could keep this hidden, she was wrong. I wasn't going to confront her without being absolutely certain of everything. No half measures. The next morning, Greg called. "Got something for you," he said, his tone serious. I leaned forward in my chair. "What is it?" "The number belongs to a guy named Matthew Carter. Late 40s, divorced, runs some kind of real estate business downtown." Matthew Carter. The name didn't mean anything to me, but the details started forming a clearer picture. A divorced man with no family ties, a perfect match for someone like Emily, who probably thought she could sneak around without consequences. "Send me everything you've got on him," I said. "Already did. Check your email." I opened the file a few minutes later, scanning through his history. Greg had done a thorough job: addresses, business licenses, social media profiles. There was even a photo of him, likely pulled from some networking event. It was the same man I'd seen in the cafe, the one who had leaned in too close to my wife. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of anger and determination. Emily hadn't just crossed a line, she'd burned it to the ground. That evening, I acted like nothing was wrong. Emily was her usual bubbly self, chatting about her plans for the retreat while scrolling on her phone. I wondered if she was texting him, making plans for their next rendezvous. "What time are you heading out tomorrow?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Around 9, she said. "I'll probably be back Sunday afternoon." I nodded, feigning indifference. "Drive safe." As soon as she went to bed, I started working on the next phase of my plan. Confronting her outright wasn't enough. I needed her to feel the weight of her choices, and I wanted Matthew Carter to understand that he'd made a mistake getting involved with my wife. First, I reached out to a private investigator, someone I'd worked with before on a business matter. I explained the situation and forwarded him the file Greg had sent me. "I want everything," I said. "Where he goes, who he meets, what he's doing when he's not with her. Leave nothing out." The investigator chuckled. "Sounds like you building a case." "I am," I replied. The next day, I followed Emily again. She packed her bags and left the house right on schedule, driving to what was supposedly the retreat. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel on the outskirts of town. I parked a block away and waited. It didn't take long for Matthew to arrive. He walked into the hotel without even checking the surroundings, as though he had nothing to hide. I snapped more photos, capturing every angle I could. Then I called the investigator. "They are at the Serenity Suites," I said. "Room 214, if the front desk clerk wasn't lying to me." "Got it," he replied. "I'll set up surveillance." By the time I returned home, I had enough evidence to confirm everything. Now, I just needed to decide how to use it. I sat in my office late into the night, staring at the photos and messages I'd collected. This wasn't just about Emily and Matthew. It was about me reclaiming control. They thought they could humiliate me, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Sunday couldn't come fast enough. By Sunday morning, I was ready. Emily had no idea I'd been following her movements all weekend or that I knew exactly where she'd spent her so-called retreat. She walked into the house with the same casual confidence I'd seen in her at dinner, a faint smile playing on her lips as she set her bag down by the door. "Hey," she said, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "How was your weekend?" "Quiet," I replied, looking up from my laptop. "Yours?" "Oh, you know, meetings and icebreakers. Typical corporate stuff." Her lie was as smooth as ever, but now it only fueled the fire inside me. "Glad to have you back," I said, standing up and heading toward the kitchen. Emily followed, chatting about how tired she was and how the retreat had been exhausting but productive. I nodded along, barely listening. My mind was on what I'd planned for later that day. I'd spent the past 48 hours not just gathering evidence but laying the groundwork for the first phase of my response. This wasn't just about Emily and Amor, it was about Matthew Carter, too. He thought he could waltz into my life, take what he wanted, and walk away unscathed. He was wrong. Around noon, I excused myself, saying I had errands to run. In truth, I was heading to Matthew's office. His business was listed online, Carter Realty Solutions, and I'd already scouted the location the day before. It was a sleek, modern building in the middle of the city, all glass and polished steel. I walked in with a manila envelope tucked under my arm. The receptionist looked up, smiling politely. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to deliver something for Mr. Carter," I said. "It's personal, so I'll need to hand it to him directly." She hesitated, glancing at the envelope. I didn't give her time to ask questions. "It's about his involvement with my wife," I added quietly. Her smile faltered, and she quickly picked up the phone. Moments later, Matthew appeared in the lobby. He looked exactly as he had in the cafe, polished, confident, and completely unaware of the storm heading his way. "Mr. Carter," I said, handing him the envelope. "I think you should see this." He opened it, his face darkening as he pulled out the photos I'd taken at the cafe and the hotel. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low. "You tell me," I replied, stepping closer. "You thought no one would notice? You thought I wouldn't find out?" Matthew glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention from his employees. "Not here," he hissed. I smiled. "Oh, don't worry. I'm not here to cause a scene. But you should know this, if you don't cut ties with Emily and stay far away from my family, these photos will be the least of your problems." He started to speak, but I didn't wait for a response. Turning on my heel, I walked out of the building, leaving him standing there with the evidence of his betrayal in hand. When I got back home, Emily was on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled as I walked in. "Get everything done?" she asked. "Yeah," I replied, sitting across from her. Productive day. The weight of what had just happened hadn't fully settled yet, but I could feel it. This was just the beginning. The first move had been made, and now the game was truly underway. By the time Monday rolled around, I could already sense the shift. Matthew Carter wasn't the type to quietly accept a threat, and Emily, well, she still had no idea what was coming. I didn't intend to give either of them the satisfaction of staying in control. This wasn't going to end with a simple confrontation. I started my day as usual, but my focus wasn't on work. My mind was on the next phase of the plan, and making sure both of them felt the weight of their actions, and ensuring Emily didn't have a single place left to hide. Just after lunch, I got a call from the private investigator. "Got something you might find interesting," he said, his voice calm but edged with intrigue. "What is it?" "I've been tailing Carter like you asked. Turns out, your wife isn't the only married woman he's been involved with." That was unexpected. "Go on." "He's juggling at least 2 other affairs. Different women, different cities. I've got photos, texts, and even video footage of him leaving one woman's house late at night." I leaned back in my chair, processing what this meant. Matthew wasn't just a cheater, he was a serial one. This information opened a door I hadn't considered before. "Send me everything," I said. I think it's time his world started falling apart. By the time I got home, I had the full report in my inbox. I stayed up late reviewing it, piecing together a timeline of Matthew's escapades. The more I learned, the clearer my path became. He'd built his life on lies and manipulation, and I was going to use those same tools to destroy it. The next morning, I made an anonymous call to one of his biggest clients, a luxury real estate firm he managed accounts for. I thought you'd want to know, I said, disguising my voice slightly. Your top agent has been using company funds to support personal relationships. You might want to check his expense reports. I knew they'd investigate immediately. People in Matthew's line of work couldn't afford even a hint of scandal. It wouldn't take long for them to find discrepancies. Later that day, I called another one of his clients and repeated the same story, careful to adjust the details just enough to keep it believable. By the end of the day, I had reached out to 3 more companies, all of which relied heavily on Matthew's reputation. That evening, Emily sat across from me at dinner, completely oblivious to the chaos brewing around her. She laughed at something she'd seen on her phone, the sound cutting through the room like nails on a chalkboard. "What's so funny?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Oh, just something on social media," she replied, brushing it off. I wanted to scream at her, to confront her right there, but I held back. She wasn't ready for what was coming next, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The next day, I got a call from Greg. "Your timing's impeccable," he said. "I just found something interesting." "What now?" "Your wife and Carter have been using a shared email account to communicate. One writes a draft, the other logs in to read and respond without actually sending anything. Sneaky, but not sneaky enough." He sent me screenshots of the emails, and I felt my blood boil. They weren't just planning weekend meetups, they were talking about a future together. Moving in, merging finances, even traveling abroad. It was as if I didn't exist. By the time I finished reading, I had everything I needed to take this to the next level. Emily thought she'd found a way to build a life without me, but she didn't realize the foundation she'd built it on was crumbling. Sunday had been the first strike. The dominoes were falling now, and by the end of the week, neither Emily nor Matthew would recognize the lives they once thought they controlled. By midweek, the cracks in their carefully constructed lives had started to show. I could feel it, an invisible pressure building, the calm before a storm they couldn't possibly prepare for. Every move I made was calculated, every step bringing them closer to the edge. It started Tuesday morning. I got an email from the private investigator. Attached was a video of Matthew sitting in his car outside another woman's house. The timestamp showed it was taken late the night before. Another affair? I muttered to myself, shaking my head. Matthew Carter wasn't just reckless, he was arrogant. He thought his charm and confidence could shield him from consequences. I forwarded the video to one of his clients anonymously. The email subject line read, "Would you trust this man with your investments?" It wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. That same day, Greg called with another update. "Remember how I mentioned Emily and Carter were using that shared email account?" "Yeah, what about it?" "They've been making plans." "Real plans." "Emily's been looking at apartments downtown, and Carter's been asking about short-term leases." For a moment, I couldn't speak. They were already planning a life together, while I sat in the house I'd built for us, the house she was so eager to leave behind. I thanked Greg and hung up, staring at my desk for what felt like an eternity. Anger boiled in my chest, but it wasn't the wild, uncontrollable kind. It was focused, deliberate, and it drove me forward. That evening, I decided it was time to push Emily out of her comfort zone. Over dinner, I casually asked, "Have you been thinking about making any big changes lately?" She paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean?" "Oh, I don't know," I said with a shrug. "You've been talking about work a lot lately. Thought maybe you were considering a new job or something." Her smile was tight, forced. "No, nothing like that." "Why do you ask?" "No reason," I replied, letting the silence hang between us. The rest of dinner was awkward, and Emily excused herself early, claiming she had emails to send before bed. I stayed downstairs, my mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, I received a call from the private investigator. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Try me." Carter's other affairs, they're starting to collide. One of the women found out about Emily, and she's furious. She's been calling his office non-stop, leaving voicemails and sending emails to his co-workers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Matthew had been so busy covering his tracks with Emily that he hadn't noticed the fire he'd started elsewhere. "Send me the details," I said, a plan forming in my mind. By that afternoon, I had what I needed: screenshots of emails, angry voicemails, and even a few social media posts from one of his other lovers, exposing their relationship. I compiled everything into a neat folder, labeling it for public distribution. That night, Emily came home later than usual. She seemed distracted, barely speaking during dinner. I didn't press her. I wanted her to feel the growing tension, to sense that something was wrong even if she couldn't pinpoint what. As she went to bed, I stayed in my office, staring at the folder I'd created. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end, not just for Matthew but for Emily too. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about ensuring they could never rebuild what they'd destroyed. By Thursday morning, everything was in motion. The evidence against Matthew was building, and Emily was growing more restless by the day. She'd started spending more time on her phone, sneaking away for calls, and checking her email when she thought I wasn't looking. It was clear she felt the walls closing in, even if she didn't fully understand why. I decided it was time to raise the stakes. That afternoon, I sent an anonymous package to Matthew's office. Inside was a USB drive containing every piece of evidence I'd gathered: photos of him with Emily, screenshots of their messages, and details about his other affairs. I included a note that read, "Thought your team might want to see this before your next client meeting." The package was sent priority, ensuring it would arrive by the following morning. Later that day, I called the private investigator again. "I want you to track Emily tomorrow," I said. "She's leaving the house?" "She'll think it's her idea," I replied. That evening, I set the stage. Over dinner, I casually mentioned that I'd be tied up with work all day Friday. "I'll probably be stuck in meetings until late," I said. Emily barely looked up from her plate. "Busy day?" "Yeah," I replied. "Probably won't even get home until after 9. She nodded, but her distracted expression told me everything I needed to know. She'd already decided how to spend her free time. The next morning, I left for work as usual, but instead of heading to the office, I parked a few blocks away and waited. Sure enough, just after 10 a.m., Emily left the house. She was dressed casually but had spent extra time on her hair and makeup, small details she didn't bother with on a normal day. I followed at a safe distance as she drove downtown. She parked near a coffee shop and walked inside, glancing around nervously. A few minutes later, Matthew arrived. This time, there were no smiles or laughter. From the sidewalk, I could see them arguing, their gestures sharp and tense. Matthew kept glancing at his phone, likely wondering how much damage the package I'd sent would cause. I stayed outside, taking photos from a distance. Their argument lasted nearly half an hour before Emily stormed out, her face flushed with anger. She didn't go home, though. Instead, she drove to a park on the edge of town and sat in her car, staring at the dashboard. It was time for the next phase. I made a call to Greg. "Are we ready?" I asked. "Everything's set," he replied. "Do it," I said, hanging up. Within minutes, the emails Emily and Matthew had been exchanging were forwarded to key people in Emily's company, including her boss and HR department. I didn't stop there. Screenshots of their conversations were also sent anonymously to Matthew's largest clients. The fallout was immediate. By mid-afternoon, I received confirmation from the investigator, and Matthew's office was in chaos. His clients were pulling contracts, and his co-workers were whispering about the scandal. Emily's company had called her into an urgent meeting, where she'd be asked to explain her inappropriate relationship with a known client. That evening, when Emily came home, she looked like a shadow of the woman who had walked out that morning. her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her usual confident demeanor was gone. She didn't even say hello. She just dropped her bag by the door and sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. "Rough day?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. She glanced at me, her eyes full of something I hadn't seen in years, a fear. "Yeah," she muttered, running a hand through her hair. "Something like that." I didn't push her for details. I didn't need to. The first dominoes had fallen, and the endgame was just beginning. Friday night was quieter than usual. Emily barely touched her dinner, her phone clutched tightly in her hand like a lifeline. I could tell she was waiting for something, an email, a call, or maybe a lifeboat to pull her from the wreckage I'd unleashed. Whatever it wasn't coming. She excused herself early, heading upstairs with a vague mention of being tired. I stayed in the kitchen, letting the silence settle around me like a cocoon. The wheels were already in motion, and there was no stopping them now. Around 8 p.m., I got a call from Greg. "It's all over the place," he said, barely able to hide the excitement in his voice. "Carter's reputation is toast. Clients are dropping him left and right, and one of his exes went full nuclear on social media." "What did she say?" "She posted everything. Screenshots, photos, even voice messages. People are eating it up. His company is already getting slammed in the comments." I couldn't help but smirk. Matthew Carter had built his life on lies, and now it was all unraveling for everyone to see. "Good," I said. "Keep an eye on it. Let me know if anything else pops up." When I went upstairs later, Emily was already in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't even look at me when I walked in. "Long day?" I asked, feigning concern. She nodded weakly. "Work's been stressful." I didn't press her. I wanted her to sit in her discomfort, to feel the weight of everything crumbling around her. The next morning, things escalated further. Emily's boss called early, demanding a meeting with her at the office. I overheard her on the phone, stumbling over her words as she tried to come up with an excuse. "It's a misunderstanding," she said, her voice shaking. "I can explain everything." She left the house in a rush, leaving behind her usual polished composure. I waited until her car disappeared down the street before making my next move. I logged into the shared email account Greg had uncovered and composed a message to Emily's parents. I kept it short, attaching just enough evidence to make my point clear. "You deserve to know what your daughter has been doing. This is why our marriage is over." Within minutes, the message was sent. Emily had always cared about appearances, especially when it came to her family. This would destroy whatever pedestal they'd put her on. By noon, I got another update from the investigator. Matthew had been fired. His company had issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions, and his remaining clients had started pulling their accounts. When Emily came home later that day, she looked like she'd been through a war. She avoided eye contact, dropped her bag by the door, and sat on the couch without saying a word. "How was the meeting?" I asked, my tone light. She glared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't what?" "Don't act like you don't know." I raised an eyebrow. "Know what?" Her composure broke. "I know you've been meddling. You think I don't notice? The way you've been watching me, the questions, the way everything's falling apart all at once?" I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Maybe it's not me. Maybe this is just what happens when you build your life on lies." She froze, her expression shifting from anger to something closer to panic. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, cutting her off. "I understand that while I was building a life for us, you were out there tearing it apart. I understand that you thought I'd never find out. But most of all, I understand that you underestimated me. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, but I wasn't done. You should check your email, I said. Your parents might want to have a word with you. Her face went white. She stood up, clutching her phone like it might shield her from what was coming. I watched as she disappeared upstairs, slamming the door behind her. That night, the house was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. The storm wasn't over yet, but the damage was undeniable. The morning after Emily stormed upstairs, the house felt heavy. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, like the calm before a final storm. I sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee, replaying the events of the past week in my mind. I had done everything to ensure they wouldn't just fall, they'd shatter. At around 9 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Greg. Thought you'd like to know, he began, his tone carrying a hint of satisfaction. Your wife's name is trending in her company's internal emails. HR circulated a statement this morning about maintaining professional boundaries. They didn't use her name directly, but it's obvious who it's about. Good, I said, leaning back in my chair. And Carter? Worse, Greg replied. He tried to salvage one of his big accounts, but the client forwarded him screenshots of the emails you sent. He's finished. His office is already clearing out his desk. I couldn't help but smile. Every piece of their lives was crumbling, just as I'd planned. But I wasn't done yet. Emily came downstairs around noon, looking pale and disheveled. Her usual polished exterior was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the consequences of her actions. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee. We need to talk, she said quietly. Talk? I echoed. About what? Your retreat? Your spa day? Or maybe the emails I found? She flinched at the mention of the emails. I made a mistake, she began, her voice cracking. I don't know what I was thinking. It wasn't supposed to get this far. Which part? I asked, my tone cold. The affair or the part where you were planning a new life with him behind my back? She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. It didn't mean anything. He didn't mean anything. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that filled the room. Didn't mean anything? You were looking at apartments together. Talking about traveling abroad. You were ready to throw everything we built away for someone who didn't even respect you enough to be faithful to just you. Her tears spilled over, but I felt nothing. I'd spent too long feeling betrayed, and now, all I had left was resolve. What do you want me to say? She pleaded. That I'm sorry? That I regret it? I do, okay? I regret everything. I stood, leaning over the table so we were face to face. Regret doesn't fix this. Regret doesn't erase what you did, and it sure as hell doesn't undo the damage you've caused. She broke down, sobbing into her hands, but I didn't stop. You going to pack your things? I said, my voice low and firm. You going to leave this house today? And if you think for 1 second I'm letting you walk away with anything more than the clothes on your back, you're delusional. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face contorted with anger. You can't just throw me out. Watch me, I said, grabbing my phone. I opened my email and pulled up the divorce papers my lawyer had sent over days ago. You'll be receiving these by the end of the day. Sign them, or we can take this to court. But trust me, you won't like the outcome. She stared at me, stunned. You've been planning this, she whispered. I straightened, looking her dead in the eye. The moment I found out about you and Carter, I started planning. And unlike you, Emily, I finish what I start. She left an hour later, her suitcase dragging behind her. As she stood by the door, she turned to me one last time. You'll regret this, she said, her voice trembling. I smiled. The only thing I regret is not seeing you for who you really are sooner." When the door closed behind her, I felt something I hadn't in months: a freedom. The weight of betrayal, anger, and doubt was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had taken my life back. Matthew and Emily had underestimated me. They thought they could play their games without consequences, but they were wrong. They'd lost everything, and I'd gained something far more valuable than revenge: control over my own future.